Beauty, that has been shifted from Batak to Mughal tent at 2:30. The Negroland, that session has been cancelled. So in place of that, we will have literature versus cinema at 2:30 here. For now, the session here is Picture This with Esther Freud and Hannah Rothschild, introduced by Alexandra Pringle, and that's a Women Uninterrupted series. We have many sessions here which are sort of, around the women, and those are Women Interrupted series. So this is one of those sessions. Do you tweet, all of you? Have you been tweeting about JLF? Any of you have tweeted or collected points and then collected goodies from here? Any of you? The tweeters? None of you are the tweeters? But anyway, I just want to let you know that if you tweet at hashtag ZJLF, you get points and collect points, and when you have enough points for that, you can go to the information desk. They'll have the information. You collect points, and then you collect the GLF goodies, which are quite nice. So keep tweeting, keep sending pictures, your opinion about any session or any favorite author or any favorite venue or whatever, something I would say nice, good about JLF, or your opinion. Keep tweeting at hashtag ZJLF. Yeah, that will be here. Yeah. No. On the other sessions will be, if I get the information. Right now, I don't have any information about session 97. It is supposed to be here. It will be here at 3:45. Yeah? I know in this venue, people have been wonderful. I don't know whether I'm very strict or whatever, but nobody is reserving the seat, and I'll expect the same throughout today, tomorrow, and day after, that, you don't reserve seats. Take one seat, no seat for your bag or for your jacket. If you come with a cup of tea or anything which you wanted to eat during the session, take the empty plate, empty glass with you. Keep the venue clean as it was. And if you see anything, which is just, around and it's not looking nice, pick it up, throw it in the bin. There are plenty around. And your phones should be on silent. It's very disturbing to the authors and to the people who are sitting around you, who are here just to listen to the authors. So if you have an urgent call, go outside, have your chat and come back, but don't talk on the phone while sitting in the session. Another thing which I notice, and I find it very disturbing, and I'm sure it is very disturbing for the authors who are here for you, that when the session is over and we have the question answer session, people just sort of, get up, start going to the next session or whatever is in their mind, they get up and going. I would say, sit through the session, sit through the question answer session. Sometimes you get to listen a little more. And even, when a question is asked, in the answer, you will see some more from the authors, which can be very valuable, very good. So don't leave in the middle of the session. unless you have to sort of, for some emergency or urgency, you have to leave. You can do that, of course. And for security, I mean, we are all very much in control here, but in case of any emergency, we have marked all the exits. Just stay calm. We will be with you. We will lead you to safety, but stay calm and exit quietly and without causing any kind of stampede or anything. I don't think that'll happen. It has never happened. We are totally sort of, conscious about the security arrangements here. But in case of emergency, just follow the instructions. We will be with you. We will take you to a secure exit. So I'll just check on our authors. They should be here. They have been very nice, wonderful. They are always here in time. I'll just go connect with them, and I'll be back with the session. Picture this: Esther Freud, Hannah Rothschild, with Alexandra Pringle. Welcome, Esther Freud, Hannah Rothschild, and Alexandra Pringle for the session Picture This, Women Uninterrupted series. 3 great women on stage for you.
Thank you. I'm fine. No, don't tighten it. That's fine. Yes. Okay. Can you all hear all right? All right? Thank you. My name is Alexandra Pringle, and I'm editor-in-chief of Bloomsbury Publishing. And I'm very, very happy to be here today, both to be in Jaipur, but to be with 2 very special authors, Esther Freud and Hannah Rothschild. If I lose my voice, I'll just leave it to them. I'm sorry. I'm a bit croaky today. This is a very unusual event. It's unusual because writers rarely step into the art world. And when they do, in my opinion, they usually fall flat on their faces. There are some exceptions. I think Joyce Carey's novel, The Horse's Mouth, is one, but they're very few. And it's quite something that 2 novels have come out within 24 months of each other that both have the world of art and artists at their center. In their very different ways, they are both exceptional works, and they are indeed works of art themselves. Esther and Hannah share other things, family matters in a way, which I hope we'll touch on. But first, I just want to talk a little about each of these writers. Esther Freud's first novel, Hideous Kinky, was published in 1992. And I was lucky enough to be the editor on the book way back then. It was immediately a book that was embraced by the public. It was also made into a film starring Kate Winslet, as somehow it's a book that has just continued in the air, as some books do. And indeed, the title, Hideous Kinky, which I had colleagues at the time who said, you can't call a book Hideous Kinky. And then the title was used by newspapers over and over again. Things became Hideous Kinky. With that, her first book, she was chosen by Granta magazine as one of their best of young British writers. And Esther went on to write a further 6 novels, before this her 8th, Mr. Mac and Me. And it takes a year in the life of the Scottish artist Charles Rennie Mackintosh, in which he spent many miles away, thousands of miles away from his home in Scotland on the east coast of England just before the First World War broke out. The Sunday Telegraph wrote, an elegiac novel of art, war, and friendship, her fine evocation of Mackintosh's melancholy on the home front, expressed in his painstaking watercolors of local flowers, celebrates the power of art to outlast both man-made and natural disasters. I think this is Esther's very finest book so far. And Esther is, of course, the daughter of the great painter Lucian Freud and the great-granddaughter of Sigmund Freud. Hannah Rothschild also comes from an extremely unusual and interesting family. She's the daughter of Jacob Rothschild, banker, arts philanthropist, and an extraordinary force of culture. Hannah is a documentary filmmaker. Both Hannah and Esther started in different professions. Esther was an actor when I first met her, and Hannah is a documentary filmmaker, and she particularly made films about artists. Her first book, The Baroness, was about her extraordinary great-aunt, Nico Rothschild, who left her chateau, her husband, and many children in pursuit of the jazz musician Thelonious Monk after just hearing one of his records one day. Hannah is a trustee of the Tate Gallery, and she's the first ever woman chair of the National Gallery of Art, and indeed the first ever woman chair of any major art museum in Europe. This is an amazing thing. And The Improbability of Love is her first novel. It's set in the art world, and in this novel she manages to do something extremely difficult, to combine delicious satire with an underlying theme of what happened to art owned by Jews during the Second World War. And I believe many Rothschild paintings disappeared during this time. As the art critic John Richardson, the biographer of Picasso, said, satirical, provocative, and exceedingly humorous, this novel has fun with today's art world. Rothschild delights us with glimpses of London life as louche, chic, and freakish as early Evelyn wore. So first of all, Esther's going to talk a bit about her book and read from it, and then Hannah will do that.
Well, thank you for that lovely introduction. It's really so nice to be here with Alexandra, who I've been edited with by for pretty much my entire writing career. I feel very blessed. And Hannah, whose book I just finished on the plane here and loved and laughed and was moved by. It's just absolutely brilliant. This book, Mr. Mac and Me, is it's really the story of a young boy called Thomas Maggs. He's a 13-year-old son of the man who runs the local village pub in a little village right on the coast, the most easterly coast of England. And his family are very poor, and they had many, many children. And as I discovered when I was researching this, so many people's children died in infancy at this time. And he is the 8th but only surviving son of this family, maybe the 7th, in fact, I think of it. He was born with a lame leg, so he's limping. And because his parents are very fearful for his future, that he won't be able to work in the fields or work on boats going out to sea, which are the two professions that the people in the village tend to work in. They send him to a school where he will learn to be a clerk, hopefully, or something where he uses his mind and his hands rather than his feet and his body. But what Thomas loves more than anything is the sea. And because he's not allowed to go to sea, he starts to go and sit by the river in the estuary where the boats come in and draw pictures of the boats. And that's probably all you need to know. I'm just going to read a couple of pages from the beginning where he first comes across this very unusual figure to arrive in the village, this mysterious Scottish man who appears, and eventually he and Thomas become friends. I always bring my glasses and almost always forget to put them on. I know the book so well that often I just kind of wing it, but I remember today. Mr. Runnicles is losing patience with me. When he looks through my books, he says I must copy out my work at home with no sketches and no blots, neat and tidy. That's what he wants from me, without a single picture of a boat. There's a table in the public bar set against the wall, just big enough for my ledger, and I like to sit there on a Saturday morning when Father is away over at the brewery ordering the ale. But this Saturday, a man comes in, not anyone I've seen before, and he stands at the bar talking to Mother. He's got a gruff voice, low and hard to understand, with rolling R's and sudden lifts and burrs, and if I close my eyes, I can hear the chimes and rises in it, like the girls who come down from the Highlands every year to gut and pack the herring. But those girls are mostly red and pink and jolly, whereas this man is dark, with a stern, pale face and eyes as black as bark. Glasgow, he tells Mother, is where he's from. Scotland's first city, a great bustling place, the best there is, although he's ready, just for now, to be leaving it behind. He coughs then, and a shudder runs through him, even though it is July and warm. He orders a pint of beer and a half of stout to take back to his wife, who's preparing a picnic at Millside, and he hands over 2 stoppered flasks to be filled. Millside. I cease my copying, and I listen hard to see if he says anything about the Millside ghost. I want to ask him if he's ever heard the sound of apples falling. A woman had been buried there, a tall woman. They found her remains when they put a new mill shaft in. And the sound of apples falling, heavy as a cart tipped up, is a sound that's been heard just before they see her gazing in at them through an upstairs window. Before I have a chance, the man is standing at my table looking down. Very nice, he says, and I feel myself heat up as I try to push the mess of my first copying out of the way. No, he bends closer, and asking if he can, he lifts the paper with the smudges and inspects my margin full of boats. There are yawls and wherries, barges, smacks, and one long yacht with a cabin and a galley. Do you make these sketches from memory, he asks, and I have to look up at him to catch the oddness of his speech. Yes, I say, because I don't want Mother knowing how often I sit beside the river and copy the boats that are moored there, or how many hours I spend staring into the glass cabinets of the sailors' reading room where models of all the greatest ships are on display. Schooners and frigates, warships and cruisers, and one big old fishing boat that Danke made one winter when there was no fishing to be done. Very nice indeed. The Scotsman hands back my book, and he pays Mother her money, and he goes out with his flasks. It is only a day or two before I see the Scotsman again, walking along beside the river. Mac, he is called. At least that's what they call him when they whisper his business in the bar. And now I see why he is making so much talk. He looks for all the world like a detective. He's wearing a great black cape and a hat of felted wool, and he is puffing on a pipe as if he's Sherlock Holmes. He has a bad foot. I hadn't noticed that before. His shoe is all stacked up, although it doesn't stop him walking fast with his stick hitting the ground, so that I have to hurry after with my own twisted foot to keep him in my sights. He crosses the bridge, and I keep down behind the dunes as he heads for the beach. Every few minutes he halts and looks back, as if he suspects he might be being seen, he might be being followed, but it can't be me he sees. I know the land too well. It's getting dark. There is a big moon, pale as cloud, hanging over the sea, and for a long time he walks along the tide line. I keep to the highland, dipping down into the marram grass whenever he looks round. But then it seems that he accepts he is alone, because he stops and stares out at the waves. He must be searching for clues of some kind, just like Mr. Holmes. And he's looking so hard, he doesn't seem to notice how the water is washing in around his boots. I leave him to it and go back to the harbour to see if any of the night fishermen have come to untie their boats. But all is quiet, so I sit there on the wall, wondering what Mother will say now that I've missed my chores, and wishing I hadn't seen that look on Father's face, which means it is a drinking day and there's nothing I can do. I'll wait, I think, until he's too unsteady to lash out. And then there he is, Mac, standing right in front of me, the pipe puffing white into the night. "Enjoy your walk?" he asks, and without even the flicker of a smile, he limps away up the street and over the green, so that for a long while, even though I'm half-starved for having missed my supper, I'm too frightened to follow. Thank you.
Hello.
Thank you, Esther. I must say, I read and loved your book the first time, but now I'm going to read it again, having heard that. My novel is completely different in many respects, apart from the fact that it revolves around art and artists and that kind, but the milieu is very different. So I set my novel in London, which is a city where I live and I love. And I set it in the art world, which is a milieu which I know and I love. It always seemed to me crazy that more people didn't write about the art world, because it's full of so many characters. On the one hand, you've got very, very hard-working artists, curators, conservators, museum directors, and who earn practically no money whatsoever, but have devoted their life to art and to the preservation of art and to help other people understand it. And then on the other side, you've got these unbelievably kind of wealthy people who are chasing art really as kind of status symbols, of badges of honor and everything else, or trying to fill in something they don't have in their own life. So that was really the milieu of my novel. And then the story came from being a young girl. The very first germ of the story came from being a young girl and being taken to the National Gallery by my father, and wishing that these paintings could do more than just hang around and look beautiful. I wanted them to be able to talk to me and tell me what they were about and what they'd seen. So I decided years and years ago to make my novel around a painting who talked to you. And this painting turned out to be a lost masterpiece. And it was found by a young woman with a broken heart who stumbled across it in a junk shop. Little does she know it's incredibly valuable, and that people will want to find it and they will stop at nothing to own it. And she buys it, and it takes her into this world that she doesn't know and doesn't understand. And it becomes quite dangerous, because as we all know, money and huge amounts of money and things of huge value can inspire desire, and desire, as we know, can drive us all insane. I've had a little taste of that myself. But the bit I'm going to read is actually one of the passages where the painting is going to talk to us, and he's going to tell us a little bit about what's going on. And the painting was painted in 1703 in France, and he talks as a very, very old, very pompous Frenchman might talk, and he's frightfully pleased with himself, and he thinks he knows the answers to everything. So here he is deciding what is going on. As you may have noticed, the young curator is in love with my mistress. But thank goodness she's done with all that. She's packed up those trunks, labelled them as the past, and stored them away in the attic. I am mightily relieved, as love obliterates common sense. Look back through history and consider the downright foolishness and acts of moral depravity committed in love's name. It is destructive, and it's a complete waste of time. I should know, I've witnessed enough of it. Of course, love can, for periods of time, stave off boredom and hunger, But let's not get carried away. Death is the only thing that humans have to look forward to with any certainty. Anyway, back to the most important issue, moi. Annie needs to explore my history. And why is it important? Because humans need methods of classifications and reassurance. Price is one indicator of value, scholarship is another. And if a great brain writes convincingly on a painter or his oeuvre, its cachet is increased. My erstwhile owner, Monsieur Duveen, the impecunious dealer, employed one of the greatest scholars of all time, Bernard Bereson, and together they whipped up storms of desirability around many works of art. Value, of course, accrues by associations, and as St. Augustine said, tell me who you walk with, and I'll tell you who you are. When a handsome, desirable young woman falls for a plain man, he suddenly becomes attractive. And if a coterie pronounces on the subtleties of a great book, everyone wants to read it. And as far as you, my reader, are concerned, a junk shop owner and now an impoverished girl have owned me, so you don't think very much of me. But if I tell you I've been owned by kings and queens, a Holy Roman Emperor, a Pope, a great philosopher, and a few others, you might become interested. As the decades rolled by, I was passed from one illustrious owner to another, and my value increased. And who wouldn't want to own something precious to emperor or kings? Who wouldn't want to be linked to past glory, to monumental power? Most of us want our taste confirmed and ratified. Art is entirely subjective. So how soothing, how affirming it must be to share the choices of monumental figures from history. Great minds think alike. And my personal history is strewn with sex and love and lust and even a dead body or two. What follows is not an aesthetic history lesson. It's a high-class, first-degree romp. I am called and I personify the improbability of love. I was painted to celebrate the wild cascades of amour, the rollicking, bucking, breaking, and transformative passion that inevitably gives way to miserable, constricting, and overbearing disappointment. As far as my first master imbued every tiny brushstroke with unbound ardor, untrammeled desire, and unquenchable lust. And during the painting of the work, he had to accept that his feelings were a mirage, a chimera in his mind. And that, of course, is the tragedy of love. If you're lucky enough to stumble on it, it rarely lasts. Every person believes that their case will be different. Fools, damn fools.
I think this has to be the only novel ever written that has a talking painting in it.
Maybe a good reason for that.
So let's kick off by thinking about why the art world is so little portrayed in fiction and why artists, and you may disagree with me, are on the whole don't feel real to me when I read artists in novels. What do you think?
Do you want to start?
I was aware when I was writing, beginning this book, when I got to during the course of my book, which goes over a year, Charles Rennie Mackintosh, unable to design the great buildings that he would really love to be designing at this point, turns instead to his first love, which was painting, and he decides to make a series of watercolor pictures of the local flowers on this Suffolk coast. And so Thomas, who starts to follow him, as we've seen, because he's a character of suspicion as the war proceeds, he follows him to see what he's doing as he sort of wanders around the countryside, and he starts to watch him painting. And I started to become aware in my mind, oh no, this is this awful moment when everything gets really boring when you're reading, as a painting is described. And I think it's because when I was about 16, I decided I wanted to do some art history, and the teacher described the paintings in such a boring way, I actually had to stop studying art history. I'm sure it must be possible to study art history and not be that boring, but I remember just sort of almost becoming catatonic with boredom. And because I'd watched my father painting through my childhood, that wasn't boring. So what I decided to do was to imagine Thomas just watching a man who didn't discuss what he was doing, but just showed the process by you know, scrubbing things out, swearing. Well, as my father used to do, occasionally he would stab himself with a paintbrush when things went really badly wrong. And Thomas slowly starts to see with completely different eyes, the eyes of an artist. Because what I used to think with my father was he'd do something and I think, that's great. And then the next time I'd visit his studio, that had been scrubbed out. And I'd feel such a disappointment because I wanted him to progress fast. And what I didn't understand was he was looking for perfection. So I followed my story of Macintosh's art as if I was watching him in a purely practical way. And I think that took the curse off it. That's what I hope, anyway.
And of course, the interesting thing is that you always think of the artist model as being the one who's watched. But of course, you were watching back. And that's the thing about novelists. I remember Richard Ford saying he grew up in a hotel and he just spent his childhood watching people. And so you, in a way, have turned the whole conceit of what you are as an artist model over, because you had power over the situation as well, I think is...
Yes, you do feel very, very involved. You're
Yes.
urging it on with your entire body, partly because it takes so long, but I think any creative force that you're slightly part of on the edge, you know, you're urging it on to make progress. So
Yes.
you feel quite involved.
Yeah. And what about you?
It's funny, well, actually, I never sat, sadly, for your father, but I've sat for other painters, and I know exactly, I mean, are you urging them on because you want them to succeed? Is it because you want to get out of there? Because as you say, it's so unbelievably boring. Is it because, I mean, it's quite difficult. The only person I watched, I got painted by Hockney, and I watched David Hockney, and I watched him, he sets a mirror up behind him so that you can actually see him, and then you can see what he's doing. And of course, then it's absolutely riveting. But as a result, the portrait of me, I look like this, because I don't want to miss a moment of every single... And it was actually, he was painting in watercolour, which meant he couldn't make a mistake. And so it was only 9 hours. I can't tell you, I mean, both me, actually, I was with my father as well, we're both like this, kind of watching this drama unfold. So I'm quite pleased that with other people I've sat for, I haven't been able to see. I haven't quite been able to see. And also you might think, if you could see it, do I really look like that? Or, I mean, your father famously doesn't necessarily flatter people. So I think that it might have been rather disarming, perhaps. But I totally agree with you. I think that picture is such a visual experience. So that might sound absolutely obvious, but I think for someone to try and put into words what you see when you're looking at a picture is quite irritating, actually, because we all look at a painting and we bring our own past to it, we bring our own interpretation to it, and part of the wonder of paintings is you get lost in the kind of visual language or the visual experience or just the kind of emotion, even if you know stuff about it. So when someone starts to tell you what it's about, it's quite off-putting in a way, isn't it? Because it seems to be not your own experience. So like you, I tried not to describe exactly what one was seeing, or I tried to get the painting itself to tell us what it was about. I thought that might be a way around it.
What's lovely is because the painting's layered with these sort of layers of grime and varnish, you slowly, over the whole course of the novel, reveal it's not a cloud necessarily, you know, and I love the fact that we don't see the painting really for a very long time.
Thank you. I think that I've spent a lot of time in the conservation department of the National Gallery where we restore old paintings, and there it's amazing. You literally watch them painstakingly take layer upon layer upon layer of varnish and also restoration work off a painting. It can take, there's one painting at the moment, a Bellini, which is going to take nearly 5 years to restore because it's so old and so fragile that they're working, you know, 1/4 of a millimetre at a time. And so I wanted to get that excitement actually of trying to reveal what something was. But when you, I mean, were you thinking about your father when you were describing Mac, or were you thinking about something else?
I wasn't thinking about my father at all, actually. It was quite a difficult book to write. There was so much research. I needed to research the First World War in England on that coast. I needed to research, I knew nothing about Charles Rennie Mackintosh. I just had heard his name, and the only thing I knew that he was the designer of the Glasgow School of Art, and that the other thing I knew was that he'd, for a reason I had no idea why, had spent a year living in the Suffolk village during the first year of the war. Those are the only things. So I was doing all this research, and then I would get to passages where he was doing a fine drawing of some larkspur, And I would think, oh, I can do this bit. And it was only afterwards, actually, when I was first being interviewed, that someone said, did you draw on your, your own experience of watching your father work? I thought, oh, I suppose I must have. But I was so busy using my brain with all the problems I had to understand how to write sections of the book, that bit, when you get to an easy bit, you just write it. You don't have any time to think about it. So those bits sort of came for nothing.
And did you find, I mean, your father, who I didn't know very well, but I knew a little bit, was quite a frightening person. Perhaps not to you, but I think and he was also he talked about art, actually, better than anyone I've ever met. He had the way of bringing pictures and paintings I think he loved alive in the most extraordinary way. Could you have, I mean, you wrote this after he had died, I think. Could you have written it and him read it and him critique it?
I would have loved him to have read it, actually. It was, he always read my books very, very closely and gave me some really good notes.
Yeah, I'm not surprised.
And one of my novels, The Sea House, which is also set in the same part of Suffolk, it has an artist in it who makes a picture, a very amateur artist who does a picture of every house in the village. And he had really helpful things to say about that book. So I think I could have. What was interesting when he spoke about art, and I think this is what I really objected to in the art history classes, he never tried to analyze them. And I think when my first lesson in art history, when someone said, you see this, it means this, and I thought, who are you to say? How do you know? I don't agree, and I felt sort of shuttered out by it. Whereas he spoke about I don't know, he used language terribly well. He spoke well about whatever he spoke about, to be honest. I think I have two sisters who are writers as well. It's not surprising that 3 of his children have become writers, or even maybe 4, because we were very inspired by the way he used language.
I think rather interesting, if you look at all your work together, is that your father is there, because a lot of your books are very autobiographical, and this book isn't. It's the least, it is not autobiographical. It's very much part of England that you love. But in some way, so Lucian is a shadowy figure, quite an absent figure, but he's there in your other novels a lot. But in some ways, he's more present in this one than in any others. Do you feel that, or is that?
I hadn't ever thought about it, but I think all my books, whether they're obviously semi-autobiographical or not, I'm using something. I need to feel I own a story in order to write it, so it needs to feel very personal. And when I first heard the story about Charles Rennie Mackintosh, I thought, it's a great story, but it's not for me, it's not my story. And I only started to feel able to write it when I realized that the house I was living in many years before, used to be the village pub, and it had been knocked down and taken by wheelbarrow, brick by brick, to another part of the village and rebuilt and sold as a holiday house. And one of the people who'd stayed there was Charles Rennie Mackintosh. So I started thinking, Charles Rennie Mackintosh stood in this room, he slept in this room, he went up these stairs. And then I thought, oh yes, I know Charles Rennie Mackintosh, he's my friend. And I basically went to it that way. Yeah. So I was thinking about him, but it's nice that the things that you know for nothing kind of intervene and give richness to your writing. And I think that is the case. People often write autobiographically, even if it's not obvious.
Yes.
Even if they don't even realize it themselves.
So you have a powerful and idiosyncratic father, and you do, Hannah. So how has he affected your life and your work, and particularly as a novelist?
I think everything feeds in, doesn't it, to your life and your work. And my mother feeds in. There's a mother of the young woman in this book, by the way, is a helpless alcoholic. But for the record, my mother is not a helpless alcoholic. The father in the book or one of the fathers in the book is a really nasty kind of Nazi. And by the way, my dad is not a nasty Nazi. So there are, in fact, people often in this book try and pinpoint people and try and say that must be so-and-so and that must be so-and-so.
Because some of them you can recognize.
Some of them may well indeed have resonances with real people. But, so yes, no, I think it'd be impossible, actually, to write without everything feeding in, actually. I think it would be almost impossible. I don't think that my father or my mother particularly play into any of these characters, but I might be being completely, I don't think so. I mean, they're obviously always there and they shape everything, I've done in many ways, or shape lots of things I've done, but I don't think they're particularly role models. I mean, there are role models in this book. I mean, there's one of the characters, he's called Barty, and he's based absolutely on a man called Nicky Haslam, who's a kind of bon vivant decorator, who has this extraordinary thing. He goes in when nouveau riche people arrive in London, so for example, oligarchs or, Arab sheikhs, they find him. And this is true, and he won't deny this, nor I think will any of them. I've made a film about him, in fact. And he goes in there and he basically gives them a life, because they arrive with a huge amount of money, but nothing else. They don't know where to live, they don't know what to put on their walls, they don't know which clubs to join, they don't know what hobbies to have. And Nicky ostensibly is their decorator, but actually he does a lot more than that. And he literally says, right, you will collect art, you will get into horse racing, you will live in Chester Square, you will go to this tailor, you will go to this dietitian. And he kind of gives them this rather wonderful instant life. And I couldn't resist putting him in this book. In fact, I wouldn't have a party without having him, so why would I write a book without him in it somehow? That's what I felt.
What did he think of it? Did he love it?
Darling, I think I could have done it slightly better. He was very... And now, of course, he's writing a novel, I suspect, about himself, but he says, darling, definitely not.
It's bound to be. So, and you now have this incredible position at the National Gallery, and the historian Anthony Beevor wrote, this brilliant satire on the highest echelons of the art market is a bold move by the National Gallery's chair of trustees. Did you feel that there was a tension or a conflict from having this new position and writing this?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, I think writing a book is a... it was a dream, writing a novel, and writing this novel was a dream which I'd kind of, harboured for many years. And I wrote it, and I wrote it, and I wrote it, but I don't know what you've written many more books than I have, Esther, but when I was writing it, I wasn't really thinking at the time about publication or about reception or about, how it would play. I was really concentrating on trying to get to the end and trying to make it as good as I possibly could. And then I remember I was actually on holiday and I got a call saying that Alexandra wanted the book. I remember there were these twin kind of things of first this kind of unbelievable excitement that this thing I spent so many years writing, somebody, and it was her, of all people who I desperately wanted to publish it, wanted to publish it, followed quickly by, oh no! What does this mean, and what are they going to say, and what if it's no good, and what if people find all the mistakes and they expose my ignorance and all that stuff. But by then there was a kind of momentum and it came out, and luckily it went down okay. But it was a risk, and I think that it was a huge risk. I'm glad I took the risk, but in retrospect it took a lot of...
Did you feel vulnerable when it came out?
So vulnerable. I mean, perhaps that's a feeling that you get every book.
Some books by far worse than others.
Right.
And, it depends on what you are risking. I mean, I was talking in a session yesterday, and I said one of the things that you need as a writer is to be courageous. And certainly with my first book, I wrote it. In fact, almost all my books, I try not ever to think that they're going to be published. It's almost of no interest to me. It's so hard to get from one page to the next that I'm just trying to deal with that particular problem. And also, you don't know for a really long time whether the book's ever going to work. So it seems pointless to think about anyone ever reading it, because they may not. I have a few abandoned books in my drawers of my study. So that really is the least of your worries. And then there's a point where I had the same thing. Alexandra was going to publish my first book, and I had incredible excitement and real fear because it was very exposing.
It is, no, and I think it's also, it's not an autobiographical book, but, there is a woman at its heart who's been, quite unlucky in love, and I kept thinking, oh, goodness, everyone's going to think, and then maybe they're going to be right, and then what am I going to say about that? So that was... I did feel, I felt exposed professionally and personally. But I had a slight inkling of what it was like, because the first book I wrote, The Baroness, was about my family. And actually, if you want to really feel vulnerable, write a book about your family, because, that exposes, in fact, we're talking about this in another session, that really exposes a lot of, skeletons, and the skeletons come and clunk you on the head, all times of day and night. So, I don't know, writing, I think it is for the brave, actually. I think that's true.
And then there's that extraordinary thing when, as the publisher, you read a book, you read it in manuscript, and it's this creature. It's very different from reading a finished bound book. And the only way I can describe what happens with books like both of these first novels, that finding a writer for the first time, is it is literally like falling in love. It's absolutely bizarre, and you feel sick in your stomach, and you kind of tingle, and you think, if I don't do this book, if I don't get to publish it, I'll die. And it's quite dramatic. And I literally had that with Hideous Kinky, and I had that with The Improbability of Love. You can't get it for all your books, but every now and again you get it, and those are the really special ones. So I now want to move on to Jewishness, okay? Because it occurred to me as I was on the train from Delhi to Jaipur that there is something there, obviously not in your novel, Esther, but in your families and the way that you have worked your way through and out into the world that you're in and into your art, that I think does come from the kind of not just being Jewish, but being born, your family coming from a different place and drifting over to other lands, other cultures, and being often adrift in cultures, and then how you find your way into them. And I think, and there are two writers who came to mind as I was thinking this, and one was obviously Edmund de Waal with The Hare with the Amber Eyes, and I think particularly with you, Hannah, and an extraordinary family of collectors, many generations, and being kind of blown by events in the 20th century in particular into other places. And then with Esther W.G. Sebald and his attachment to the same bit of English coastland that you have. So I just wondered if that makes sense to you, if you think about it. Esther, do you want to start?
It is interesting, the sort of, I think, less really maybe about the Jewishness of my kind of heritage, but more about the fact that both my parents, or my father was Jewish, my mother Irish, that they both had to sort of make new lives for themselves. And there's a toughness, I think, that comes from that. There's a kind of grit about starting again, recreating yourself. And oddly enough for me, both my parents made decisions quite early on in their life that they really wanted pretty much nothing to do with any of their families. So I was brought up very much sort of almost like feeling like a kind of child in time. I had no relatives that I knew, hardly at all. Certainly none nearby. Occasionally we would go to Ireland and I would see my mother's family. But she used to often take us and leave us there, me and my sister, rather than stay there. So it was childcare for her. And so there was that feeling for me. I wrote 2 novels that I've used my kind of Jewish ancestry and brought them in and tied them in. And I did it for myself because I needed to feel like I belonged to a larger family. I think every generation rebels. I think I didn't know my grandfather because I didn't know any of my father's relatives, apart from the ones I've met just myself through my own volition. My grandfather apparently was sort of family-minded, more sentimental, liked having his family around, lived next door to his wife's sister, etc. Whereas my father didn't want anything to do with it. I love my family. I can't have enough of them. I'm always, inviting all my different relatives, sisters, cousins' children. So I've kind of rebelled in the only way I knew I could, by being really sentimental. That's what I could do. But I wrote a book called Gaglo, and I used some of my family history that I really had to research and make up because no one said anything. And by doing that, I kind of cloaked myself with history and with some kind of feeling of belonging. And it really made a difference. It really bolstered me up.
And then there's also landscape, which is interesting because your family, the fact that they found a piece of England that reminded them of where they came from in Germany and how that's affected
that was huge, been hugely important to me. It's almost been the great love affair of my adult life. When I was in my early 20s, I complained to my father that I desperately needed to get out of London. And he said, oh, there is a sort of rather dreary little cottage in a really awful, terrible seaside village. I used to spend my childhood holidays there. My parents had a house there. There's still a house that is in the family. Literally never heard of any of this. And he arranged, he gave me the number. a telephone number of a cousin that I'd never heard of, and I phoned her, and she said, yes, you can rent it. You know, on a November weekend, she told me where the key was under a flower pot in the porch of a house by the church. I arrived, and it was like falling in love. I went, this is my favorite place in the whole world. And I've hardly had a month where I haven't been since. That was 30 years ago. I now have a house there. This is where Mr. McAmee is set. I now have a house. My cousin, one of my cousins has a house next door. Another cousin has the house next door to that. We have all the land behind. All our children play. It's literally like the best thing in my life, and my children's too.
And it was born in the first place because it
in the 30s, when my grandparents were emigres, and in 1933 they decided very wisely to leave Berlin and come to England. They tried to find an equivalent idyllic holiday house to remind them of the house they'd had on the Baltic coast, a little island called Hiddensee, off an island called Rügen. And they found this little tiny village in Suffolk with this flat. I have a letter, actually, that I found that my grandfather wrote to my grandmother and said, the sea is nearly as cold at Hiddensee, and there's even more mosquitoes. And it was like, hooray, we found this place. And I feel completely connected to them being there. So that's really has been important.
And what about you, Hannah?
Well, my family were in a ghetto in Frankfurt for a very, very long time, a place of such indescribable squalor that people used to go there just to have a look to see how these Jews could survive. And you have Goethe and George Eliot write about this place, and they write about the Jews they see they were allowed out during the day, but at night they were kept in this very, very short street that had no sanitation, no running water. It was supposed to be for a few hundred people, but many, many thousand people lived in there. And that's where the Rothschilds started. And then it was bombed during a kind of French invasion, and the Jews were allowed out, amazingly, and their faces were so pale that people thought they came from another world because they never saw any sunlight because the street was so narrow. And famously, the patriarch, the Rothschild patriarch, sent his 5 sons to the 5 capitals of Europe. So we ended up in England. So I come from that, the English branch, which came here in the late 1790s. So since then, the family's done very well and has integrated, quite successfully into society, all over the place, frankly. But we still feel like outsiders. And I'm so pleased that I retain that feeling of being an outsider. And I don't know whether that's Jewishness. I don't know whether that's, I don't quite know what that is, but I've never felt absolutely integrated. And I think that's quite helpful in a funny way. I mean, I know my home is England, which I love with an absolute passion. I know I have a very strong sense of family, as you do too, but I never feel complacent about where I am. I never feel, yes, these are my people, this is my thing. I feel slightly transient, and I think that helps us, and I think it's helped us stop becoming completely insufferable, perhaps. I don't know.
So we're going to go into questions very soon, so I'm going to ask a last one, again, about families, because, well, I find families so interesting. They are, in a way, the most interesting thing in the world, and I think we create families around us all the time in different little groups. And indeed, publishing is very much about creating a family. But both of your families have had such a profound effect on the cultural life, particularly in the 20th century. And they are big. They are not just one big person. It's like a big family. Sigmund Freud, not just Lucian Freud. Generations of yours. Has it been a blessing or a curse? Do you understand?
I feel really blessed, I have to say, because in a way, maybe because I wasn't brought up, I was brought up very much with my mother, very unaware of this I didn't feel any weight, I didn't feel any pressure, there was no expectations, we were sort of rather itinerant, kind of felt a bit nomadic, and then there was this sort of kind of glimmer of glamour and excitement that my father represented, and then when I sort of joined in as a teenager, when I was old enough to kind of join in with the family, it felt exciting. And also, my father never really spoke about he never spoke about the great fruit, as his nickname for his grandfather. So it was very irreverent. There was no pressure, there was no feeling. But what my father did instill in his children was that anything you do should be done on your own merit. Never take any kind of credit for anyone else's achievements. So there's been very little kind of name dropping or entitlement in my family, but there has been inspiration. And inspiration just through sheer discipline and hard work and being passionate about whatever it is. That's why I feel blessed.
Actually, I felt an enormous weight of my family, really, sometimes almost insufferable weight. I mean, I felt that, some of them are bankers, and I'm pretty much enumerate. Some of them are unbelievably clever and got, starred everything at every university you could imagine, and I kind of crept into university in their wake. They seemed to be people who were absolutely brilliant at what they did, and I was terrified that I couldn't live up to them. I just thought, I'm never, ever going to be able to live up to any of these people, male and females, actually. And I think what happened, I was lucky enough to go and get an independent career, I mean, independent of my family, and I actually worked for the BBC for most of my kind of young adult life. In fact, through to very recently, I worked for the BBC up until 2010. And that gave me huge confidence, because I felt I'm in an organisation where actually it's almost a disadvantage to have a big name behind you. I was teased mercilessly by everybody there all the time. And, but I did all right. I made a career there. I did okay. And once I felt that I could stand on my own 2 feet and I could do something in my own right, I was then able to actually make the most of my heritage, which of course is fantastic. And I'm very, very, very fortunate in so many different ways. But it took me a long time to be able to feel that, not so much live up to it, but think, okay, it's fine. You know what? I am who I am, and this is what it is, and just enjoy it. I think maybe I've got there now. But it's taken, I don't know how old I am, but it's taken quite a long time.
And did you, because both of you had different careers first, did you always want to write?
I always wanted to be a storyteller, and and I was very seduced by film. I remember the Sunday afternoons at home. It was the only time we were allowed to watch television, was the Sunday afternoon matinee. And so I used to watch films every week, and I was completely seduced by films and wanted to go into filmmaking. And actually, the BBC at that time to me was the apotheosis of everything fantastic. So I wanted to work there, and eventually I got to work there. So, but storytelling, I wrote the whole way through that, not sometimes, for journalism and other things like that. But I never really thought I'd be a novelist. I mean, I'm not sure I quite accept that I'm a novelist yet. Maybe you have to write a few books before you can do that.
And Esther, going from acting, that was...
I also wanted to tell stories. I never imagined I could be a writer, because I was not particularly academic, or I just couldn't, it seemed just an ambition beyond one I would even give myself. So I was an actress, and I loved the telling of the stories. But then just naturally I started to write, and writing just became my real pleasure. And then I wrote what turned into a book, to my amazement, and I imagined I might do both, but actually writing made me really happy. And I realized then that acting didn't make me very happy. And so I just felt incredibly lucky that I'd managed to find a way of crossing to a much more nourishing career.
Okay, we must squeeze some questions in.
We actually have got just 3 minutes, so
I'm so sorry.
Maybe just one question.
Okay.
Just one question,
Okay.
or maybe, you're so much, we'd love to
There is a question
hear from
over
you.
there.
So we take a question. Okay, so just one question, and then
Okay.
unfortunately we have to...
Sorry, my watch is
Yeah.
5 minutes off.
Me too, I
Sorry, people. Hi, my name is Abhijit Bhargav, and I'm a journalism student. So my question to you is you said that if you want to be nervous, if you want to be really nervous, you must write about your family.
Sorry, can you hold the microphone slightly closer to my
I'm
mouth?
sorry.
Thank you.
You just said that if you want to feel really nervous, you should write about your family. But my question is, and then you talked about other family values and how much you should cherish your family. So my question is, should a writer have any kind of secrets, even if regarding their families? Because we all have skeletons in our closet.
So basically, should a writer ever have secrets?
Yeah, of course. I've got millions of secrets. I'm saying I won't tell anyone else.
We long, come on, more. It's
No
only
way.
her first novel.
No, I know,
Who knows?
exactly. I can eke them out.
I have very few secrets left after 8 novels. There's not much anyone doesn't know about me.
But you should use those secrets in your novels, in your writing, so that other people can learn and read.
I don't think you need to use up secrets particularly, but the really powerful parts, the really authentic parts of anyone's work is when it means a lot to you. And there's sometimes things that is quite painful to write about. I've written things in my books that I never said to anybody, but I have other things that I want to write about that have been quite traumatic, and I've found that I couldn't go there. Maybe I'm just not ready yet. Or maybe I just never will, and I will try not to upset. But I'm not, I have to say, in a selfish way, I'm not avoiding it because I'm frightened to upset people. If it's good, I'll write it. I'm just not able to do it quite yet, maybe.
So is that the piece of glass in a writer's heart?
Yeah, for me, I'm such a, in my life, I love to get on with people. In my writing, I'm ruthless.
Really?
I'm shocked by myself.
I think I'm going to have to take lessons.
Writers have to be ruthless, I'm afraid. Are we through, or was that?
We're almost through, yeah.
Okay, we're
If you
through.
can just close the session,
All right.
that'll be wonderful.
Okay. So I'd just like to say thank you. What a wonderful, illuminating, fascinating session this has been. I feel we've learned about the art world, about literature, about families and displacement and so many things. And I'd just like everybody to say thank you so very much to Hannah and to Esther.
Once again, a big round of applause for Hannah Rothschild, Esther Freud, and Alexandra Pringle for being here. They have so much to say, and unfortunately, the sessions are for just 1 hour. But I'm sure they will be there at the back. They'll be signing the books, and you can have a conversation with them. You can ask your questions to them, and I'm sure they will be delighted to answer your questions. Thank you for being here.